Really appreciate it. Would love to start out by just getting to know you a little bit more. Why did you personally get involved in this work? Why did you get involved in pro-democracy work, but specifically the work at Civic Lex?
Sure. Yeah. I came to this work sort of through community development. I used to run a community development corporation here in Lexington um found through that work the importance of think helping people find their sort of agency over their own community. And when I left that job, I left it in a little bit of a challenging moment in a variety of ways. And when I was looking for something to do after that, I think the idea of trying to make it easier for folks to understand just how much power they have over what the decisions that are made here in Lexington and how, a relatively small group of people can make a pretty significant difference. I wanted to build something to help people really see that. And CivicLex is really what came out of that. I had a small grant from the Knight Foundation through this Emerging Cities Champions program, where I was working at the sort of intersection of civic information and public transportation. And I, got connected with some folks that had a nonprofit that had been sort of dormant for a couple of years, and sort of together we built CivicLex. But it was really about less about sort of like democracy and the big capital D large democracy, and more about how do we get people to really be able to see the way that their sort of life intersects with local democracy every day.
So let's go off that for a second. I'm curious, there's this broader conversation going about like what pro-democracy community is, what pro-democracy movement is, and you've done great work at the local level and been sort of outspoken on the importance of the local. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about how you see the work at Lex being around that sort of smaller D democracy work, helping people feel like they're part of something and how that fits into the broader pro-democracy work or how it might be separate. But how do you place it within the broader context?
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, right, democracy work on all scales, from local all the way up to national and even international, right, is about the sort of concept and project of self-governance and what it means for us to have a real say in what happens in our lives and what happens in our sort of the shared, community, whether that be the shared town, state, country that we all live in. And for me, I think that, the level at which that really manifests in people's lives, right? The level at which people really actually can get individually involved and individually shape something that is impacting their life is the local level. I don't think we talk about our work here in Lexington as being part of the pro-democracy ecosystem. I think, um, for a variety of reasons, I think that framing and that language isn't necessarily helpful. But I think, if you were to really zoom out, the goals that we're trying to accomplish are a very localized version of many of the goals that institutional reformers are working on at the national level, that bridge builders are working on at the national level, and that civic educators are working on, through policy and through other means. So, I think oftentimes we forget that we live in a federalist system, right, where decisions that shape people's lives are made closer to home than in many other democracies around the world. And I think for that reason, more local approaches is really what we need to sort of flesh out the pro-democracy system that we're sort of building here in our country.
Appreciate that. Why do you think, and maybe this has changed recently, but why has it been difficult to get people? I'm projecting a little bit, but you've talked and written about this, so not too much.
Yeah.
Why do you think it's been difficult for people, funders, philanthropists, organizations to focus on the local? Why do you think that there's been more of a focus on some of the national solutions than sort of this place-based approach?
I think there are a couple of reasons. I think one, I think one of it is just like efficiency of investment, right? I think one of the things that we hear a lot from funders or have heard a lot from funders is that, um, you're too local to fund. Your organization is too focused on a very specific place. It's very challenging for me to make an X size investment in just this one place. I want to have a broader impact than that. And sort of my counter argument to that, right, would be that it is that they're just prioritizing, sort of breadth over depth. It's the same amount of peanut butter, it's just getting spread over a bigger piece of toast. And so I think that's one reason, and it's also a reason I understand. There are also logistical complications around that, right? I mean, I think in Civic Lex's very early days, our budget was very small, and so I think um, yeah, our budget's still very small compared to a lot of national organizations. And so I think that, it doesn't make sense for a funder to be investing $300,000 in an organization whose budget is $300,000, right? I understand the logistical reasons, and the challenges that would come along with that. Um, so I think that's one sort of reason in two parts, right? There are logistical reasons, and then there are uh, the sort of legibility reasons, I suppose is the best way of saying that first one. Um, I also think that funders don't really understand, and the sort of ecosystem more broadly. I hate to sort of pigeonhole funders, but I think funders in the broader ecosystem don't really understand the value of place-based work. Mostly because I think that the precedent for it um, uh, has been sort of wrapped up in national movements, right? I think pro-democracy funders, I feel like to fund movements. They don't like to fund like actual things, like projects, like hard projects. Um, and place-based work, I think, has been wrapped up in sort of that type of movement funding, right? Where they're funding like a national project to happen in a bunch of places. And I think that a lot of times those types of initiatives can really overlook the nuances that happen on the ground, the sort of local infrastructure that's already exists, and the issues that are really important to people in their communities. And so, there it sort of sets up this little bit of a tension between the two. But I think, it would be hard for a funder to really understand all of that sort of all of the things that are playing out on the ground. So it does make sense, I think, in some ways. I understand the reasoning behind when folks say it's more challenging to invest in the local level. I think the last thing that I guess two other quick things on that. So one, um, I also think that, and this is maybe a little bit more of a heavy-handed critique than the other parts of it, but I also think that like funders traditionally come from elite institutions. And I think that elite institutions, particularly on the coasts, um, do not understand um, how national movements don't really appeal to people in the center of the country because they don't feel connected to their lives. And I feel like folks that are coming from elite institutions are sort of get wrapped up in a little bit of a bubble. And I think that that sometimes makes it harder to see um, the complexity and nuance that is required when looking at place-based work. And I think there's a lot of writing on this sort of, um, idea of, investing in movements and not membership. And um, I think that, what we really need to be looking at in our field is how we can make pro-democracy work actually appeal to people's lives, right? How we can make it really connect with people in their everyday world and not on a theoretical level, on a really practical level. And I think that's just very challenging for national organizations to do, but I think it's very, very easy for place-based organizations to do.
Appreciate the candor there. So walk me through a little bit about like, I mean, you said that, like, I mean, I assume when you're talking to folks in Lexington, you're not talking about, hey, do you want to be part of this pro-democracy work? But
Yeah.
you're engaging with folks that care about the communities, that might be distrustful of institutions, that might be frustrated
Mhm.
with things that are happening. How do you appeal to their lives? I mean, walk me through what it looks like on the ground, what Civic Lex is doing to make people feel like that they're part of what you talked about as self-governance. How do you actually engage
Yeah.
folks on the ground in that work?
I think the first thing that like I always tell people about this is like it is the longest game that you can possibly imagine, right? I think we're often conditioned to have like really immediate impacts, like, oh, you really need to have immediate, like people need to immediately be flipped from being like, anti-institution to pro-institution. And like that's just not going to happen, right? We're trying to change people's hearts and minds into believing that like participating in your community and how your community makes decisions will be effective. That requires a lot of things. It requires helping people actually understand that that's possible. It helps understanding people what their options are to actually doing that. It requires helping people build the relationships to actually enable that. And communities our size, the sort of relationships between people and everyday folks and sort of people in positions of political power is the sort of grease and lubricant that enables people to make decisions or to shape decisions effectively. And we also need institutions that actually genuinely want to hear from people. And so we're trying to convince a lot of different people about a lot of different things, right? We're trying to convince institutions how to work differently. We're trying to convince people that know the issues that, these issues that you care about every day, housing, transportation, jobs, environment, all that stuff is actually shaped at the local level in a lot of really meaningful ways, if not, you know, shaped more so at the local level than at the national level. Um, and we're also trying to do, help sort of convince people that when they go to do this, it will actually do something, and it just takes time. And so I think all of that combined makes us take a really long-term approach, right? Like we're not about convincing people to change their mind on getting involved in their community tomorrow. We're trying to provide as many opportunities as frequently as we can for people to opt in at their own speed. And sometimes for some people, it'll take a week. Sometimes it'll take a decade for some people, right? Some people have been really, really burned by a system that in the past and in many ways in the present doesn't want to hear from them. And so there's good reason that they're suspicious or that they are distrustful of institutions. So it takes a really long time. I think that's the first thing. I think part of it isn't how we talk about it, right? We're not saying pro-democracy work like you said, right? What we're saying is like, hey, we want to help you get involved in the decisions that shape where you live, and really try and pull it back to people's everyday lives, right? Like, I was I frequently bike to work, and there are on my bike, it's about an 8-minute bike in. There are easily 12 potholes that if I like missed, I would just like bite it, right? Like I would flip over the handlebars of my bike. I would maybe break something. At the very least, I would be wildly embarrassed and probably a little banged up. Um, that is a civic issue on the way here. And when you say potholes to people, I think people think it's really trivial, but for a lot of people, it's not, right? Like these types of everyday things can be can be really transformative to people's lives. Say you hit that with your car and it causes this big auto bill, and then you're already financially strapped, and so this pushes you even more into debt. That's something that I think is part of everyone's everyday lives, and so they have a stake in wanting to address it. But I think people just don't we're not provided the sort of educational baseline um, as it relates to our local communities to really understand that we have a pathway to getting involved in those issues. So we really try and tie our work into people's everyday lives. And then I think the third thing is like for us, you know people don't really want to be lectured at. And I think the democracy world, the pro-democracy space, has a big lecturing problem. I think like the whole, I guess I'm part of it. So we all, I feel like just, want to chide people into caring about this stuff. And that doesn't seem to be effective, right? It doesn't seem to be effective at all. And so I think, well, the alternative to that is like, why don't we do things that people actually want to be a part of? And so for us, that means like trying to have fun events, when we're trying to get people's input on, what the future of public spaces in our city looks like. We're gonna have a bouncy slide castle thing. We're gonna bounce a castle on a bouncy slide. We're gonna have face painting. We're gonna have fun activities that people actually want to be a part of. Um, and that goes such a long way to breaking down that initial barrier. So it takes a really long time. You have to tie it to people's lives. It has to be fun. And ultimately it has to do something. I think that's like the biggest, maybe the biggest one of all, right? Getting people engaged. This is something we learned like very directly through our work. Like getting people informed and engaged can actually be counterproductive if that engagement doesn't result in something positive for people. If they go from I don't really care about this stuff to then, oh, I do kind of care about this stuff. I'm going to go show up at the council meeting, or I'm going to write my congressperson or whatever. And then that mechanism for engagement is either bad or yields a bad outcome for people. They move backwards, right? They don't move forwards to wanting to be more engaged. They get more distrustful of institutions. And so I think we run some real risks in the pro-democracy space of actually polarizing people against the things that we're trying to encourage them to do if that engagement is bad and or doesn't result in something. It can't be an intellectual exercise for people. It has to be people's lives are very stretched. People's time is very valuable. And if you waste their time, nothing is going to put them off more than that. And so those are the different things that we think about a lot in our work and how we try and bring folks in a little bit of a different way.
Okay, so if you're, I mean, this is broadly speaking, but if you're talking to a funder, it's like, all right, I'm convinced that this place-based approach makes sense, and like it seems like there's more of a focus on this in a post-elections landscape. You're doing great work in Civic Lex, but what does it mean to actually focus on this? Is it about, people like really looking more to their communities? How can we, I mean, it sounds a little bit oxymoronical, paradoxical, but like, how can we like broadly focus on local work?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think that there are like so many missing gaps in the pro-democracy infrastructure, right? Like you have these like very big national organizations that are doing, that are doing their work. Um, then you have these like hyper local organizations like us or like Warm Cookies of the Revolution in Denver or like Village Square down in Tallahassee or there are a whole host of them. Um, and there's not a whole lot in between, right? There are some intermediaries, like you have this sort of like this sort of you know mo- uh, field specific intermediaries like New Pluralists or the Trust for Civic Life or or any one of the other I feel like handful of them that are out there. Um, but I think what we really need is actually a little bit more connective infrastructure between these things, right? Those intermediaries are still very national, and they're investing in places sometimes, oftentimes. Um, but like, I think we need more state infrastructure. I think we need more regional infrastructure. I really look to the community development landscape, right, where they have community development corporations, they have community development financial institutions. There are regional support systems like the Local Initiative Support Coalition or LISC. You have some federal investment, you have state investment, you also have local investment. So there's this ecosystem, right, that exists in the community development world, and there are ecosystems that exist in many other fields. But here we either have national infrastructure because people care about national politics, or we have local infrastructure because people care about getting things done in their communities. But we don't have the things in between that are really needed. And so my uh, plea to the funding ecosystem, to the funder gods out there is, you know, help build that infrastructure. Talk to place-based practitioners, ask them what they need to support their work. Like if you want to make $1 million investment in local work, I think helping stand up state-based infrastructure would be a really fantastic use of that funding. I think we see this emerging like rapidly in the local news space, which has of the pro-democracy ecosystem has like is thousands of light years beyond everyone else, right? That where they have press forward and these state-based chapters and regional chapters and local chapters, and they are really clearly articulating arguments. They have place-based practitioners that they're investing in through local newsrooms. They're investing in intermediary infrastructure. They're investing in national infrastructure. I mean, I think that we need that, but for the rest of the ecosystem. And that was a funder-led initiative, right? A bunch of funders got together and said, you know what? We really need to be investing in local news. Let's build the infrastructure to make it happen. And they're doing it. Um, and I think we really need that for the rest of the ecosystem. That being said, local organizations that are doing really amazing work also do deserve direct investment. And again, I think you see that strategy mirrored and pressed forward. Um, because a lot of these organizations at the local level have been, I think about Village Square has been doing this for 20 years. I mean, these organizations need investment, and we've been told forever and ever and ever that that local is too small of a scale. But now that the conversation's turning to local, I do think we need to be more comfortable with making direct investments at the local level, but also building that supportive infrastructure because we can't just keep making local investments in every community in the US for the next 100 years. That this infrastructure needs to be self-supporting. Um, so that would be my request.
Well, I appreciate so just a few more questions, but I appreciate the thinking on that because I mean it's just a useful analog. I wonder if you can quickly talk through, or I mean just talk through the Kentucky Civic Trust. So I know that like this is a state, I mean, you're talking about the importance of state-based efforts. How did this come to be? Is this sort of how you're thinking about like a potential, not analog to what you're talking about, but a way to think about that intermediary approach?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is. Yeah, it is exactly what I'm talking about, I suppose. So, the Kentucky Civic Trust really came out of a couple different conversations. So one is a conversation happening here in Kentucky. There are a handful of us in this space in Kentucky that have all experienced the same challenge of attracting national investment. Kentucky's in it's pretty low ranked in the states of philanthropic investment. Um, there isn't a whole lot of statewide philanthropy here. The philanthropy that is present is very regional. So, you sort of have to be in the exact part of Kentucky that that these funders exist in to receive funding. And if you're outside of that pocket, it's really challenging. And so myself, in building Civic Lex, my and my two sort of colleagues in this effort, who are folks that I've been working with for over a decade, Savannah Barrett, who started the Kentucky Rural Urban Exchange 11 years ago, and Carly Metertees, who started the Kentucky Civic Education Coalition. The three of us sort of through our work together, um, just complained about this a lot. And eventually we were like, okay, well, you know, I think being told you're too local to fund, or this isn't big enough for me to fund yet, the scale's not large enough yet. Um, you can only get told that so many times. You're like, okay, there has to be like a better strategy for this. And for us, it was like, well, what if we created something that could be that local intermediary, that could attract national investment, sort of help coordinate local investment, um, but really, help seed this kind of work across the state and invest in, folks that are doing really wonderful, sort of nonpartisan civic health work across the state, um, who like shouldn't have to go through the same challenges that we all went through. So that is sort of at the local level where that conversation came from. And then, at the national level, as the trust, we were, part of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, our Common Purpose report. We held some conversations before the report was published to sort of help inform the report here in Lexington. And, Lexington was the first Our Common Purpose community. So we were the first community to commit to advancing the recommendations in the country. Um, and so through that, we've been, connected to sort of national conversations that are happening through our common purpose report, including the Trust for Civic Life, which originally was being called the Trust for Civic Infrastructure. And through those conversations, uh, you know, what developed into the Trust for Civic Life, I think, is that type of national intermediary that's so needed, particularly because they are investing in rural regions, in rural communities, and I think are taking an approach that um, feels like it um, isn't hewing to one political direction or another, right? It feels very much about empowering people to solve challenges in their own communities. And then the focus of those communities are in places that are very much like Kentucky, including some that are investments in Kentucky. So, those two conversations were sort of happening simultaneously, and that sort of led into this idea of like, yeah, let's build it. Let's try and build a statewide intermediary that um, serve that sort of same function that a statewide press forward chapter would. And if you look across the country, there are really robust Colorado, North Carolina, really robust statewide press forward chapters um, that sort of opened up inside existing statewide news organ like sort of news infrastructure, and the amount of investment that they've been able to leverage into their communities, the strategic way that that's been able to be deployed, I think is really admirable. And, um, I think in our dream of dreams, we can help build an intermediary that can match that, but for the broader civic health ecosystem, including local news, but also much more expansive than that.
I'm curious, like, how have you seen the focus on local change post-election? So I feel like there's this question of like what people should be doing post-election, and so I'm curious what that's meant for you.
Yeah, it's been a little bit jarring, to be honest. I feel like uh, even 3 months ago, I felt like end of October, felt like I was like still like really trying to convince people like that local stuff is really important and that it deserves investment and deserves consideration, even that it deserves to be in the same room as national conversations. Uh, and then, man, like overnight, it was like, oh well, we're all gonna have to start thinking locally now. So it's a little bit jarring, and honestly, it's like a little unsettling. I think the speed with which um, it has shifted makes me think, or gives me some concern that there are about to be a bunch of really bad investments in local civic work. Um, because it's gone from an ecosystem that that national funders in particular did not want to invest in for the most part. Um, and now they're gonna be like, okay, well, what are the strategies? And so, I think they're just gonna start throwing things at the wall and see what sticks. And, hopefully not, but that's my concern. And the reason that that concerns me so much is that things at the local level work a little bit differently. When you have a failed, intervention, which is the sort of, the way a lot of people talk about this work of like, oh, these are interventions in the sort of local civic life of places. When you have one fail, or when you have one that's bad, it does irreparable permanent damage to a place. When you have a failure at the national level, it's like a learning thing, right? Like you can learn from it, and you can learn from failure at the local level too. But like, you can learn from it, and maybe it does like some limited damage, but mostly it's just a bad investment. When it happens at the local level, it can be damaging. It can be like fundamentally, um, uh, irreparably damage people's connection and relationship to civic life. Um, and I think that I would really implore funders to seek out local practitioners as thought partners as they consider what local investment strategies may look like. Because people that have been working at the local level, and when I say local practitioners, I should be really very clear, people that are working in the communities in which they live. I think there are people that don't live in a particular place but work there, and I think that's fine. I understand I'm not against that. I think it can be really good. Um, but when you work in your own community, you have a different stake than anyone else ever could. I think about with my work, like I do not leave work. I go home, I talk to people when I'm at a bar or at a restaurant or at the grocery store. I like fundamentally, if people want to hold me accountable to the work that we're doing here at Civic Lex in Lexington, like they could find my address and come talk to me. They don't come to my house, but like it's just a part of everyday life here when you're doing local work. That's not the case for national people doing work in local communities. So I do think there is something really unique about local practitioners doing work in their own communities. They've learned a lot of lessons, um, and they know what they're doing, um, especially if they've been at it for a long time. So I would just really implore, national funders, if you're considering investing in local, go talk to Evan Weissman, go talk to Liz Joyner, go talk to, the people that have been doing this work in their place for a long time.